Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I was going to do a video just on the RP8000MK2 and I thought, well, do you know what? Let's compare it against the 1210MK2, shall we? So, two of them here. Obviously, this is belonging to one of my customers, my customer Mark. He's got two of them here with me at the moment. We'll go into why in just a second. We're going to compare this against a totally original, non-touched 1210MK2. When I say totally original, this turntable has never been serviced, has its original pitch trim, slider unit, bearings, pop-up lamp, everything. Completely untouched. All audio cables are original, power cables are original. I haven't even touched this turntable yet. I'm looking forward to ripping it apart, giving it the usual treatment that I do with all of my Technics. So let's start. So a lot of people have been asking me about the RP8000MK2 and what are the differences between this turntable and the 7000MK2. And obviously cosmetically you can see it straight away, and functionality you can see straight away as well. So the idea with the 8000MK2 is geared more toward turntablists. You have the MIDI control functions on the side that corresponds correctly with Serato. So for people that are using phase or just DVS, you can control your loops, you can control your cue points. There's all different things that you can do with these buttons here that illuminate in different colors. So it's really, really handy if you're using phase, because the one thing I do not like about phase is, obviously, there's two things. One is when you have the record spinning around and you're trying to adjust the pitch control, even regardless if it's battle style or club style. If you imagine you've got an Autophone Concord on here, or anything on here, in battle mode, you're going to constantly keep on knocking the head shell, trying to get your hand around the unit to actually use the pitch control. And even in club mode, as it is now, it's pretty annoying, to be honest. So the one thing that I tend to do is when it's all mounted on, I'll move the arm as if it's on the record, just to free up the space on the unit around the pitch unit. So it acts like a normal turntable with the needle on the arm, with the arm lever raised, just to get it out of the way and give yourself some more wriggle room. The other problem that I don't like about phase is the fact that you cue your record, you let it go, fantastic, but how do you restart the track without having to touch your laptop? This is where this turntable comes in handy. If you haven't got a very expensive mixer, so if you haven't got a mixer that's got all the built-in cue buttons that you can loop and scratch, do all the usual bits you do for your cue buttons, this is where this will come in handy, because you can obviously designate your cue points on the turntable itself. So if you have a pair of these, you can do this on both turntables. Very, very cool indeed. Top of the edge of the turntable on here, you've got your cue points saved. Pitch modulation, you've got loop, roll and shift is obviously to control various aspects of the turntable. So you'll see on here, you've got parts that are illuminated in blue and parts that are illuminated in white. So the idea is when you have the shift button down, you can pitch bend, you can do platter play. There's all different things that correspond with Serato built in with this turntable. Absolutely superb. You've got various different modes for pitch control as well, 8, 16 and 50. So again, you've got plenty of range there to play with. The holy grail of this turntable, like I said with the 7000MK2, compared to all the other super OEMs, is that one right there on the left-hand side, that pot on the left, that's the torque adjustment. So if you are used to using a Technics turntable, you will know that there's not enough torque on the platter to rip your fingers off. So in other words, if I start it up now and just brush the side, it doesn't really fight with your fingers too much. Well, it does fight with your fingers, but not enough to, you know, throw your mix off, so to speak. Now, with this turntable, if I have this on its higher settings, we'll turn the pot all the way as its higher setting on here, and we hit start, you'll see it starts pretty much instantaneously. And the brake is pretty much the same, but the brake at the moment is on its lowest setting. And that's very impressive as it is, but when you touch the platter, there's a lot of power there, a lot of torque. So if you don't like mixing on super OEMs, so we'll give you an example of this. Well, super OEMs are all made by Hampim. So we've got things like Pioneer, some of the Audio Technica turntables, and obviously Reloop's class in this category as well. There's a lot of turntables over the years that use the same internals, such as the Stanton Straight 150. In fact, if you ever use a Stanton Straight 150 and you're looking to upgrade to something else, something newer, then my honest opinion, don't waste your time unless you are looking at one of these or the 7000, purely for the fact that you have the torque adjustment. So I've shown you with the torque adjustment on full. If we now turn the torque adjustment on its lower setting, and then we now touch the platter, you'll see instantly that's much more like a Technics. If we compare it with the other turntable, the 1210, you can see here they're practically identical. if we start and stop these turntables, so start and start, just by looking at the strobe dots when I do this, you will see on its lowest torque setting, there's not really a great deal of difference between the two. In fact, if you were blindfolded and had to use these decks, bearing in mind all the buttons, but just touching the platter, I don't think you'd find it very easy to spot the difference just from running your finger across the side of the platter on its lower setting. So start and stop times of these, if you've got the Reloop set on its lower setting, pretty much matches the Technics. Pitch range wise, obviously with the Technics turntable, you have plus and minus 8% pitch, unless you're going to start messing around with the internals, installing ultra pitch, things like that. But the greatest thing about this most iconic turntable is obviously to do with the fact that you've got a pure analog slider. So these little increment movements that you're making, they actually do make a difference without sounding ridiculous. So there's little movements that you make, even the smallest little increment, to keep your mix in time, are affecting the record when it's playing. So that's why the majority of DJs that you see that have started out on vinyl or have built their way up from belt drives to cheap direct drives always ended up on a set of Technics, because these are pretty much the best of the business for mixing. No matter what anybody tells you, Mark II, M3D and Mark V are the ones to go for. Not M5G, not Mark VI. This Mark II, M3D and Mark V are the ones to go for the analog slider units. Much, much better for mixing and a lot tighter than anything else with digitally controlled sliders. So moving on to this particular turntable, obviously it's digitally controlled, hence why you have 8, 16 and 50. So you've got a lot of range to play with. As you can see here on 50%, you've got exactly 50% pitch, plus and minus. You've got a digital display, which, to be fair, I love digital displays on turntables. It's I'm a bit of a sucker for this. If we do it on 16, again, exactly 16%. We go minus 16%. So if you're a turntablist that needs that extra range, or maybe you want to mix older, slower music at a faster speed to correspond with something newer, then this is exactly what you want. But even on +8, if I show you the pitch control, just to give you an example, if we move this away from the 0 point, as it's digitally controlled, if we move this away now, just its smallest amount, you'll see the increment of 2 here. There's no ... 1, it's 2, then 4, and 6, then 8, then 10, etc., etc., and so on and so forth, and .4, .2 increments. So what I'm trying to explain is these little movements that you would naturally make don't move in the same aspect as to what you would have with an analog slider unit. So those little increments you make on these, they do make a difference. Extremely accurate. Whereas this, because it's obviously moving in that 0.2 increment, the argument that I was saying before to people about the Pioneers and all obviously Super OEM turntables was that when you try and just, if you've got a track playing here, for an example, and you're mixing it in and you notice that this track is playing a little bit slower and you want to just give it a small increment on pitch control just to keep them both in the mix properly while the channels are open. When you move that slider, just a tiny amount, if we get it off the lock, just a tiny amount on this, which I'm doing here, obviously it moves, but it moves in the .2 increment. So what I'm saying now is when you try and speed it up just that little amount, it may be too much. So it'll be too fast. And trying to find that sweet spot of where you want to mix, you'd have to use the other turntable. So if you've got 2 of these and you find you can't lock it, it's going to be hard trying to keep them permanently locked on both turntables, because no matter what you make, what difference you make with moving the slider unit to get them to stay in time, it's going to be extremely hard, because obviously they all move exactly the same. So you've got a pair of them, you'll find it harder work. Whereas if you've got a single turntable and a single Technics, those little increments that you need to make that you can't do on this, you'll find you'll be using on the other deck. And what's very, very common with a lot of Technics users, or any turntable user really, I've spoken to over the years, and even myself included with this, you always got a deck that you prefer using. So it sounds ridiculous, but my turntable of choice out of the 2 of them, when I had a left and a right, my left turntable I always found to be more accurate than the right turntable. Now this obviously was down to calibration and wear and tear internally, but you'll always find as a turntable that your preference of what you prefer to use. You might laugh at this, but it is true. There's a lot of DJs out there that think exactly the same as myself with this. So if you've got 2 of these in exactly the same setup and you've got one 1210 and decide to buy another turntable, you don't want to fork out all the money for the Mark VII, then this really is the best option to go by. So there's little increments. You can get it as close as you can with this turntable, and then mix in with the fine increments and the trusty Technics that you know those little increments you make are going to make the difference, keep things locked. So that's for fine tuning, that's to get it where it is. Does that make sense? In terms of build quality between the two of them, I mean, we all know by now Technics pretty much with the 1210, 1200, 1210 Mark II, etc. Build quality of these decks is pretty much second to none. That feedback, dampening, all the usual bits you'd expect on modern day turntables. This thing trounces pretty much anything that you throw at it. It was the industry standard for a very, very long time for a reason. You'd find many of these in clubs where, you know, cables would wear, pitch controls would wear, but the majority of these, as standard, were installed in clubs and they did the job from the word go. This turntable, I'd say, is exactly the same. I mean, build quality is phenomenal on this. It's exactly the same in terms of build quality of the Mark VII. It's a heavy unit, same as any other Super OEM deck. Lovely to look at. It's a very nice turntable indeed. I love the fact that it has the digitally readout for there. I love that. Brake and torque adjustment, in my opinion, is a must. Torque adjustment if you are a mixing DJ. If you're used to Super OEMs, just slap it on turbo. That's the best thing to do. But in my opinion, if you're a mixing DJ, I mean, you want to put it on its lowest torque setting possible. But everybody's different. You've got people that come off of Vestax that want something that starts and stops quick. You know, it has quick play with the platter. So putting it on turbo mode may be what you're used to. I'm not saying one is better than the other for this. If you are purely a turntablist, both of these turntables are perfect for you. DMC, obviously Technics DMC, there's a reason why it's Technics DMC. These were the iconic decks. Obviously now we're getting into the new domain with more modernised equipment. These will do the job exactly the same, if not better. So you've got to bear in mind as well, you have something that's brand new out of its box. You have your warranty, you've got box fresh components that have been built up in a factory. So you know it hasn't been sitting in somebody's garage, it hasn't been sitting in somebody's shed for years and years and years, collecting dust in the hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold. You're getting something that is new out of its box. Now, coming back to what I said at the very beginning of the video about the reason this turntable and the other turntable to match this is actually sitting in my workshop, is because of the bearings. Now, on Super OEM turntables, it's very common that the pivots become loose. Now, what I'd say to you is if you're watching this and you've got a Stanton or any of the other Super OEM branded turntables like the Pioneer, take the arm off its rest and try rocking it backwards and forwards, and you'll actually feel lightly with your fingers and you'll be able to hear it over the pivot. There'll be movement between the actual gimbal section here and the bracket. And what that is basically the pivot locking section here, the bearing pivot. You've got an outer locking ring that you have to loosen, and you have to slightly nip up the bearing itself. Now, the best way to do this is by taking the arm out of the turntable, because if you do it on the rest, you may very well get it right, but there's every chance that you can tighten it up too much. That'll affect, with an S-bend arm like this, it'll affect the anti-skate. And you want to make sure it's as freely moving as possible, but it also has no movement here on the arm. Now, if you're happy with how your turntable's acting as it is and you're happy with the movement, then fine. Things like the Mixars, the LTAs, for an example, exactly the same situation as this. They were loose as anything with the pair that I actually I reviewed, did exactly the same procedure. So this is a very common, we'll call it a common issue. It's definitely an issue. It's something that should have been rectified in factory, but sadly hasn't. And it's the majority of Super OEM turntables out there all have exactly the same problem. Very simple to sort. So on this one turntable, we had the top pivot that was too loose and the side pivot there was too loose. So I've managed to rectify that for my customer. There's no movement now at all. And the other turntable was just the top pivot was loose. So we managed to solve this for them. So that's the reason why this video is happening in the first place. I'm very grateful for, actually, to be honest. I wanted to get my hands on an 8000 for a little while now. About shelling out the money just to buy them, you know, and try and send them back. But yeah, mix-wise comparison between the two of these was where things got a little bit more interesting. So as you all know, I repair, customize, service these turntables 6-day weeks, pretty much. I'm usually in nearly pretty much 6-7 day week. 3 to 4 pairs of these every week. It's insane. So I'm always spending all of my time on Technics turntables, because obviously what I do. So comparing it against this, now I had the 7000 Mark II, I had a pair of them brand new boxed a little while ago, as you'll all know from my videos. Didn't really get on with them in terms of mixing. I mean, even the lower torque setting, it did make things a lot easier for me. But I just couldn't get that sweet spot to keep things locked, and my hands were continually either on the platter or on the pitch trying to ride the pitch to keep things locked. Now, this turntable, I know when I spoke to Reloop directly, because I have an account with Reloop as well, when I spoke to Reloop about this, they explained to me what I thought, which was that the 8000 is exactly the same turntable internally as the 7000, but obviously with the additional sections you see here. So you can go through your navigation points for your tracks. They've got the MIDI control functionality down the sides. Everything else on this is identical, apart from obviously the readout for the pitch. Mixing on this turntable is no different, in my opinion, to the 7000. It's something very strange with this deck, though. Now, I noticed when I was mixing in a track purely from Spotify, so I ran through my Pioneer testing mixer here, Spotify through a line input, and we ran this in the output from this turntable also in the line input, because you also have selectable outs on there. You've got two different sets of RCA outputs for phono and line, which is very handy if you don't want to use phonos, obviously, on the input of your mixer. So if you don't have, for an example, a 4-channel mixer that has more than 2 or 3 phono inputs, then obviously you can use the line output of the turntable instead of using phono. So you can use an older mixer with line inputs to run turntables. Pretty cool. But yeah, when it comes to mixing on this, again, it was the same scenario with the Mark 7. So you get it just that little bit where you need it to be, want to get it just a little bit faster or a little bit slower, make your increment movements, and it's too much or too little. So for those of you out there that are looking at buying a pair of these purely for beat mixing, I was finding that I'd get probably about 30 to 60 seconds with them locking in before you're physically having to touch the slider if you were lucky. There are some videos out there I've seen on YouTube where people have been getting records and just leaving them together to see how long they actually drift out, and very commendable, the person that's done this. I found it exactly the same. Every record is different depending on the way that they're pressed as well, and the condition of the records too. So it is pretty much hit and miss what locks properly and what doesn't lock properly. In my opinion, it's no different using this to what the 7000 does, but you can lock a mix, okay? I can confirm you can lock a mix, but you have to use your pitch between 30 and 60 seconds. That's been the average I was expecting over an hour's worth of use with this turntable, going through Spotify, switching tracks over, changing different styles, and just playing around with things in general. The other thing that you do have on this turntable is the pop-ups here can be interchanged. They just literally lift in and out, the same as all of the other Super OEM turntables. Obviously, it's very handy when compared to something like the Technics. If your Technics lamp blows or you don't like the colour, you have to physically take the entire unit apart, take the assembly out, take the pop-up out, change to an LED, pop a resistor in line, and obviously do that correctly, you'll change the colour. But where I'm getting at is, if you want to change the colour of this completely, there are different kits you can buy that just literally clip out and pop straight on. And also, if you do have the unfortunate accident that the LED does blow, which is quite unheard of really with any of these decks, but you can just take it out, pop another unit on, and off you go as well. The only thing I don't like about this particular pop-up, or say the actual target lamp, we'll call this, we've got a pop-up lamp, we've got a target. So the target on this particular turntable, if I turn the brightness down on my lamp over here, and we turn that down, you can see the output here. So its brightest point, you can actually see the way it shines to about here. But I'm not a massive fan of the colour, the actual illumination colour, in my opinion. I know it matches the rest of the turntables. It's not quite white. It's a cross between almost like a dark, sort of almost like a purpley white, to be honest. But that's not my preference with turntables, but everybody's different. Obviously, with the original lamp, you can see here it is much brighter. And you're pretty much going over to here until you get the illumination start to die off actually on the Technics. Whereas on the Reloop, you keep going all the way out. It still shines out. It's about the same, but I'm just not very happy with the illumination side of things with the target lamp itself. It's removable, so that's a big thumbs up for anybody that's interested in that. As far as the arm is concerned, with the height adjustment, it's no difference really to a Technics in terms of adjustability. So you've got your locking section there. Obviously, Technics has a locking section as well. The rings can seize on a Technics. You're not really going to have that problem on the Reloop. To be fair, they're way too new to have that problem, and they're a completely different mechanism altogether. Anti-skate on this particular unit being an S-bend arm. Obviously, you have anti-skate on an S-bend. Both straight arms do not have anti-skate. They'll have a blank cap there. It looks exactly the same with no mechanism underneath, because you do not need anti-skate on a straight tone arm. Not for DJ use, but you've got 0 to 3 on the anti-skate here and 0 to 3 on the anti-skate of the Technics. Okay, the actual Weights themselves look pretty much exactly the same as the Technics 2. I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, you know what we'll try while I've got this here? It's the first time we're trying this. We'll take the weight off of the Technics. It's very loose on the back of the Reloop. We'll try and interchange them and see if we can get that to go. In fact, there you go. So the Reloop, which obviously needs a bit of tightening on the back of the support of the arm, but for those of you out there that are unable to get the Technics rear weights, it actually fits better. It actually locks and fits better on the Reloop than on the Technics. So again, for those of you out there that have got Mark 7s, I mean, this is pretty handy for you, but they're already in this colour anyway. But yeah, if you've got an old Reloop lying around, an 8000 lying around, which I doubt you have, just bear in mind that that part there is interchangeable. As far as the markings are concerned, if we put these both together, so the lowest point there we've got is obviously 0. If we put these both together so you can see the difference between these. So 0 at the top. 0.5, you've got 3.5, 3, 1, 1.5, 2, 2, and 2.5. It's exactly the same. It is exactly the same. So that's something to bear in mind if you fancy changing over the rear weight on your Technics, I suppose. You wouldn't really want to do it the other way around because the unit's already black and looks really nice on the Reloop. But again, it's each to their own. But it's a very handy thing to bear in mind if you ever want to change that on the back just for cosmetics. So the arm tube on this unit, obviously S-bend, you can see it's been anodized in a nice black. The only thing that can happen with these arms, which I knew this was going to happen, it happens with all of them. You can see here it's quite shiny where the locking section goes over. This will happen with anything really that's been anodized. It happens on all of these Super OEM turntables, whether it's black or silver. Even polished turntables do this with the aluminium on the arms. I mean, you've got slight mark there on this one as well. It's nothing you can really do about this. Even if you were to, say, for an example, take the arm tube out and wrap the arm. I mean, I wouldn't recommend this anyway, but some people have done this before and asked me to do this, wrap them in carbon and camo and things. Very, very hard, tricky job to do. But you're still going to have, when the lock goes over, it's either going to eat into the vinyl if you vinyl wrap it, or anything you put over the top here to protect, it's still going to eat into the unit itself. There's a lot of parts on this turntable that look like they can be replaceable with Technics parts as well. I mean, I'm not going to say anything specifically with the arm units. I have used arm assemblies from these turntables, so any of the older Super OEM turntables, it's a very well-known fact that some of these parts do fit, and they're practically identical in terms of fitment for the base. So if you have got a broken tone arm assembly on a Technics, for an example, you may find that a cheaper alternative to buying, say, a Mark 7 assembly or a newer assembly from something else to fit might be the way to go. But price difference wise may be about the same, but it's worth looking into because the socket, the tube, etc., I will see no reason why you couldn't do that on its own and fit them into a 1210 Mark II, Mark 5, etc. The one thing about this as well, so the pitch trim, obviously on the Technics it's removable. You clean all the original adhesive off, you can replace the pitch trim. On the Reloop section here, I'd imagine this will be replaceable as well. The thing I don't like about the pitch trim on the Reloop, you see the LED? The LED is underneath, it's flush under, it's not actually even completely flush at an angle. It's not actually going through the housing and it doesn't actually look straight and in line. That would do my head in. So I'd imagine, I mean, I'd be able to sort this and actually have that poking out of the assembly as it should be, in my opinion. But the 7000s were exactly the same. But you can see where they're coming from with these Super OEM decks. Obviously, they're not carbon copies of a Technics. They're both completely different animals altogether. But there are big similarities to how these function. I mean, start and stop buttons on these, I don't know if you can see this here with the light attached, but the actual speed selection buttons here, they are both illuminated. I don't know if the reverse one is. The reverse is also illuminated. The only one that is not illuminated is the start and stop, which is a shame really. But again, the actual button itself is not rubberized like these buttons are here. It's made out of plastic, the same as what the Technics buttons are. You also got the pitch reset button, the same as the M3D and the Mark 5. So no matter where you are at the pitch, and you see that I hit reset, it sets back to 0, and your speed here will set back to perfect quartz 0 lock as well. So no matter what you do or where you are, it sets it back to 0. Again, turntable is like this. You also got no click on the slider unit, which is a ball bearing and a spring, in other words. It's a housing. You've also got the pitch control housing that has a hole cut out in the side. There'll be a ball bearing and a spring, and that's what physically creates the click that you have on a Technics slider unit. So you can just hear that there. There's also no lock on the board either as far as that's concerned. So when you go down to the green lamp section here, you'll see there's a slight movement here, but the lock is pretty much non-existent. And the way it's been designed, especially if you calibrate a Technics turntable correctly, the idea is to have, when you get, just before you get down to the 0 position, just here for an example, it should start to slow down, or if not completely stop, before you get to the lock. So for all of these DJs that tend to want to remove the click, they all say to me, Jay, can you remove the click? If you're removing the slider unit for a brand new unit, then yeah, I've got no issues with doing that. Removing the ball bearing and spring and then, you know, going down that route of a slider that's between, you know, 30, 40 years old, I would not recommend it. I mean, you don't know what the condition of the lock is inside, the condition of the traces around the lock on the carbon track. If you're going to do this, you do it on a brand new unit. That's what I tend to tell people now, and I don't do this with original older units. It's not worth doing unless you're going to bypass the lock completely, which then defeats the object of having a Mark II, because obviously the Mark II has a physical lock with a ball bearing and spring, and in my opinion that has never bothered me. I always start my tracks faster and I'm never at the 0 position. 8000's the same really, start your tracks faster and away you go, but you haven't got the lock, so you can mix around the 0 point with ease. There's no nasty jumping or anything, so if I have it slightly off of the lock, you'll see there that the strobe dots are still steady. There's no movement going the other way, even at dot point -2. It only really starts to go the other way if we get it to about -8. So you can just about see it moving slightly. But again, it makes a big difference in terms of having the lock there. So yeah, I mean, look, all in all, very, very nice turntable. I mean, if you're using DVS and you don't want to start buying additional things like a mixer that has the pads built in like I explained, very, very good choice to go for. If you're happy with, you know, loosely mixing tracks together and being very hands-on, which I will admit, I'm very much like that now. I mean, now I've got the Mark 7s at home alongside the Mark 2s that I've now brought here, which are for sale. I mean, the Mark 7s are a very hands-on turntable, and this is no different. Once you use something with digitally controlled sliders, you tend to get to grips with how they function, and, you know, it's a completely different animal to using what you're used to. So it's the equivalent of going out and, I don't know if you're into cars, like going out and buying a cheap Ford and then going out and buying a Ferrari. I mean, you know, they're going to be different to drive. They're going to react differently. This is no different. You know, you put a record on, you put a needle on, great, but it's getting to terms with the pitch control. It's a big thing with a lot of these turntables. But yeah, also, like I say, phono and line on the back, you've got 2 independent outputs. So you can plug this into a line input on the back of a mixer instead of using the phono inputs instead, which is great if you're doing it the old school way. But if you've got a mixer that hasn't got phono inputs on the back, or you've used your phono inputs with 2 Technics, then this is a very, very ideal thing to bear in mind for a third deck. And if you've got a 4-channel mixer, you can plug 2 of these in alongside your current setup, knowing that you can use them. The only thing to bear in mind with this is the minute that you hit the power button with the line output, the audio will completely switch off. Completely switch off until you hit that power button back on. So if you're trying to do wind downs, for an example, to do like that and to slow the turntable down at the end of a mix or something, if you've got it on phono, it's fine, but line mode, it completely shuts it off, which is a little bit annoying, but not everybody does this. But this is pretty much, this is the best turntable that Reloop offer, and in my opinion, it is the best super OEM turntable that you can buy, purely for the fact that you have, in my opinion, the digital display on there. It's a nicer looking turntable than the majority of the other ones out on the market. And again, for the price difference between this and the PLX 1000, this will whoop the PLX all day long. The internals are practically the same. The pitch control, the motor and the arm assembly, internals, all the same. And it's just, in my opinion, a much better turntable with more functionality. You've got more play on there for cue points, etc. You haven't got to go out and spend an absolute fortune on mixers because you can do everything from the turntable. So phase users and DVS users, this is ideal. As far as using it with Tractor is concerned, now you can comment below if you actually own RP8000s and you use it with Tractor, because I've not looked into this, but I would imagine you'd be able to map this with Tractor. I see no reason why you couldn't. I'm sure you can freely map these buttons here to do something on the software, whether it's the equivalent up the top here for Serato, I'm not sure, because obviously this is designed for use with Serato. But I'm confident you'd be able to do this. If I'm wrong with this, you're more than welcome to comment below. But they've been out for a long time now. The older models have been out for a long time. So I'd imagine you could do this. But yeah, in my opinion, that's a great turntable. 8000 Mark II, fantastic all-rounder. For DVS users, phase users, excellent. The fact you've got the 2 outputs on the back, you've got the controllable digital display for the pitch, you've got the torque adjustment, you know, brake adjustment, which I haven't even shown you yet, because even on the lower setting, it does start quite nicely, start and stop nicely. So this is on standard classic mode. You've got classic mode and maximum brake. If I now hit start, so we go off the slowest, this is the slowest, sorry, not the maximum, this is the slowest mode. So you've got a 6-second stop there. So start, you see it slowing down. And obviously when you adjust it on its maximum, instant. And when you've got the torque adjustment on its full setting, or they call it turbo setting, brilliant. So brake adjustment on its maximum setting and torque adjustment on low, you match the performance in terms of rotation and braking ability. Is what the classic Technics does. There's not really any difference there. So the big question that people have been asking me about these over the years, I mean, would I buy a pair of these? The answer is, yeah, I would. I mean, why wouldn't you? It does everything that you want a turntable to do. I mean, you can run DVS through it. You can pull a mix off on these. I mean, I'm very hands-on with my Mark 7s and turntables in general anyway, so I get to grips with digitally pitched quite easily. It's just whether you want something that you're going to lock in and pretty much walk away and make a cup of tea. Because that's what you can do on these if you're still using the original sliders. A lot of people used to do this all the time, where you'd get a track at the beginning, you'd lock it in, you'd let both tracks go, and you'd find that 9 times out of 10, if you're very good with your mixing and you're very tight with your mixing, that you could leave both decks running at exactly the same time and they just stay in time with very minimal effort. You know, the odd little push here and there, but the minute they're locked, they tend to stay where they are. This is the good thing about trusty Technics. The Reloop, again, I can guarantee you now, if you got 2 of these side by side and did exactly the same, you are not going to get to the end of the record. I'd be very, very surprised if you get to a quarter of the way through the record and it's still locked. There's a lot of comparisons that people put up with turntables where they're using 2 of the same record. I mean, I'd be more impressed if people do these comparisons with 2 completely different records on 2 completely different labels, and you know the speeds are not close to each other, and they try it again. There's no point in doing them at 0% lock. It's pointless in my opinion. DJs do not use that, and they only use the slider unit. I do, so you're always away from the 0. What's the point of comparing 2 decks, both at 0, with 2 copies of the same record? Your locks work perfectly. You're going to get drift on all turntables. They're not perfect. If you want perfection, you buy CDJs. That's it, as simple as that. But yeah, let's look at the back of the turntable while I've got this in front of me as well. I'll try and do this one-handed. It is a very heavy turntable, which is good for dampening as well. If we look at the back of the unit here, you've got a removable power cable. And you can see on the back here as well, you've got the USB, the link input, which obviously I think you can connect it to another unit. USB straight to the computer for the Serato side of things, and obviously tractor, I believe you can do that with, like I've said. Phono output with its grounding point at the back, and the line output. Now, the other thing about this turntable, because a lot of people ask me if you can get dust covers for 8000s, the answer is yes, you can. They actually do offer a kit. It comes with the hinges, and then you can buy the dust covers with the sockets. Sorry, hinges, sorry, it comes with sockets. You can buy hinges and sockets and dust covers. You can have dust covers on these decks. Failing that, I'm pretty sure you can get away with deck savers. In my opinion, deck savers are the way to go on just about every turntable now anyway. For the price of a single deck saver, especially for a Technics turntable, if you were buying a single dust cover for one of these, you'd be looking about between £100 and £120 for a brand new one. There's no point buying second-hand scratched rubbish. Deck savers you can buy for the price of one dust cover brand new. You could buy probably 2, nearly 3 deck savers. So they sit straight on top. The problem you have with deck savers on Technics turntables, particularly the Mark II in particular, and the M3D, is the sockets at the back. Now, deck saver never made their units with cutouts for the actual sockets at the back. And I repeat this every week to people that come in that want to have things vinyl wrapped. So the biggest problem that you have is, if you imagine they're designed to sit flush on these decks. So it'll be flush at the front, flush at the sides, and it will go up at a slight angle because the back hasn't got the cutouts going through to sit on top flush. So what you have to do is you have to undo the screws at the back of this particular one's actually loose anyway. So you have to undo the screws at the back and physically drop the height down of the socket. The best way to do this is quite simply just unscrew one screw, tighten the other one up before you undo it. There's a plate that sits behind the back of the physical fixing plate, and you screw the screw back into the base when you angle it down, and you can have the screws and the plate still in place with the sockets removed. Now, with this, you haven't got to worry about that because obviously it hasn't got the dust cover as standard, so there's no sockets on the back or hinges that come with the unit. So if you're going to be using deck savers from the word go, just to stop things from getting dusty and dirty, then that's another win-win. So all these things can be done with the Technics. I mean, between the two of these decks, if someone offered me a pair of Reloops, offered me a pair of Technics, and they said, look, you can only have one pair for the rest of your life, Jace, you know, pick wisely, it's always going to be Technics because these are accurate, they're super accurate, great feedback, great audio quality. I mean, there's lots of upgrades you can do on these as well. You can choose whatever you want. I mean, you've seen the bits that I do on the page. If you're on my Facebook page, you'll see this as well. Plenty of scope on the upgrades on these. You can change the arms over, you can vinyl wrap them, you can change the trims, you can change LEDs, change the switches, plenty of internal parts that you can do. But the Reloop from the word go out of the box does everything that you want. So if you're looking for modification side of things, customization, there's very little that you can do on these. I obviously don't vinyl wrap these. There's a lot that goes into these turntables. I could vinyl wrap it if I really wanted to, but truth is I don't have the time to do it as I purely touch Technics turntables. You can buy skin kits for these, 12-inch skins off of skin kits. Do them for all sorts of things, for the Reloops, for Rain, Pioneer, you name it, and Technics as well. They do template kits that stick over the top. I might even do some that sit on top that are made out of plastic. I used to do them quite a long time ago for Technics. But yeah, I'd buy a pair. I'd probably buy one as a third deck, sit alongside me Technics, because it is a lovely looking turntable. But yeah, it's a great all-rounder, very heavyweight platter as well. And in my opinion, the best Super OEM turntable. When I say Super OEM, I mean a hand-pin created turntable. This is the best of the best. Does everything you want a turntable to do. You know, it's still a very expensive unit, like the majority of these are, but you can get them at a good deal if you know where to look, i.e. eBay, for an example. You do get on the odd occasion people that need to sell them. They get into hard times, need to sell them, or just get bored of them and want something else, or they go back to Technics. Happens all the time. I offer them a lot. So keep your eyes on eBay. You can pick them up for quite a good price. Yeah, that's my take on the RP8000MK2. As far as Technics is concerned, if we were comparing this unit to the Reloop again, like I say, you've only got plus or minus 8% pitch. For most mixed DJs, that's all you need. If the lamp blows, you can replace it with an LED. You can put another lamp in there if you want. Switches can be replaced. LEDs can all be changed in colour. You've got the shader cloth underneath that can be replaced. The arm can be rebuilt, but the parts that tend to get expensive on these is where you get problems with bearings, where things get hit on the top, things get dropped on top of turntables, the arm will bend, the bearings get damaged, and in some really bad cases, you get the plastic section here can be smashed in half, the arm can be facing the other way. Plenty of things that instantly increase the invoice amount of your turntable if you bring them in. But a lot of people have been asking me about bearings, you know, doing a video on bearing replacements, showing what damaged bearings look like. I mean, bearing replacements, I'm not going to do a video on this. There's so many people that have done very similar videos on YouTube. I mean, it's no hidden, hidden issue or hidden secret that people are using RC bearings, like miniature bearings for the actual arm. So in other words, what you do with this is you take the housing out, the gimbal housing out, you remove your damaged bearing very carefully, you then remill the housing, pop a new bearing in with some bearing adhesive, get everything flush and level, and then calibrate the top pivot to get things nice and smooth as expected. The problem with replacing bearings, no matter what anybody will tell you, is very hit and miss, okay? You get a really good condition turntable like the arm with this one here. You can remill the housing can go too deep. You might drill it at the wrong angle. If you're using a pillar drill, for an example, it may be at the wrong angle if you're not lucky, and it's game over. You know, you may find that you pop a bearing in and it's not sitting flat. It sits flush on one side by eye, but the other side's not flush. And you find that when you tighten the pivot up, your arm sits at a slight angle. And also, the biggest problem with replacement bearings is the pivots can become loose. Because on these arms, the same as any of these turntable arm bearings, the bearings themselves, there's a plate that sits on the top. there's little ball bearings that go inside in a circle. There's a fine point needle point that sits in between the bearings, and that's when you move the arm like this, the ball bearings move underneath the plate on the pivot, right? If something hits the top of it and damages the plate, then obviously the ball bearings stop moving. That's why you then replace the bearings. Now, what you're meant to do is replace the arm assembly. Again, very expensive. Original units like this, I mean, original units for Mark II onwards, very, very hard to come by. And when you find them, they're very expensive too. But the problem when you use RC bearings is obviously they're miniature bearings. They're roller bearings. They're tiny with little hole in the middle, basically. And it's the middle section that moves. They're roller bearings. So when you tighten it up, the more you move this, there's every chance that the pivot can come loose. Doesn't matter how much you lock this in, or if you add an adhesive, or you add like Loctite or some bearing adhesive, this will come loose at some point. One little knock, one movement around in your flight case, they will come loose. So to nip it back up again. Very, very hard. So you are meant to just change over the arm assembly, and I can appreciate there are so many people out there that do not want to spend between £250 £300 for an arm, especially if you've got 2 decks. So it's very important that if you buy these turntables and you're buying these second hand, you need to make sure that you check the arm tube and things for play. We'll go into that in another video, otherwise it's not really the comparison we're looking for, but we'll go into this in another video. That's a brief part of the arm bearings. But the good thing about this, like I say, is if your arm becomes damaged on a reloop, I'm pretty confident they're going to have this exact arm in stock. God knows how much you're going to be paying for it, but I'll have the part, and you can pay somebody to just literally desolder the arm, the wires from the arm that go onto the audio board at the back, and change the arm over. I could confidently do that myself, and I'm going to look into this as well. But there we have it, guys. So there's going to be another video. We're going to go over the overviews of what to look out for on a second-hand pair of turntables, the do's and do not do's, things to look for when you're buying them, to make sure you do not get ripped off, or you end up falling into a trap, having to pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds on parts that you were unaware of. That's the next one. But there we go. I hope that's been helpful to people. I know I rabbit on quite a lot, but you know, I've got to be as honest and transparent as possible. Great bit of kit. Best Super OEM turntable that Handpin offer. By far, it's the best turntable. It's the top of the market of everything. This or Pioneer, this all day long. All day long. This or Technics, Technics. But it all depends on what your style of mixing is. If you're a turntablist, if you spend all your time just scratching records, then this is what you go for. Spend all your time mixing for fine tweaking, that's the one you go for. Technics all day long. There we go, guys. I'll see you on the next video.